Today Manchester has just one main airport, Manchester Airport, and it's huge, with 3 terminals, 2 runways, a train station, a tram stop, multiple nearby hotels, several extortionate car parks, enough perfume to drown a cruise liner, and a purpose-built visitor park where you'll remortgage your house just for a short visit. It's the 3rd largest airport outside of London. Its footprint is larger than most town centres in the country, and it employs more than 25,000 people directly. It's absolutely vital to the economy of the north of England. It's a city within a city. But like London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and all the big city airports, Manchester Ringway, as it was originally known, started off as a little more than a well-trimmed area of grass and some hangars. But also like these cities, Ringway Airport wasn't alone in those early days. In fact, there were loads of small airfields and landing strips dotted about the region, and in this video I want to see what, where, why, and if there's anything left to see of them today. Manchester actually has a very rich history of pioneering flight. Way back in 1785, James Sadler made one of the first balloon ascents in England, from a field near a private house where today you'll find Balloon Street. Mancunian John Alcock, along with fellow aviator Arthur Brown, made the first successful trip across the Atlantic Ocean in 1919, taking off from Newfoundland and landing in a bog in the west of Ireland. The first flight to enter Manchester was in 1910 by pilot Louis Paulin, landing in a field in Burnage before any dedicated airfield had seriously been considered. The first purpose-built one was in Trafford, which was back then one of the greenest pockets of tranquil forest land and fields, with a deer park even, and all belonging to Trafford Hall. The airfield was in this area. Now this map is from 1905, so 6 years before it opened in 1911, so it's kind of hard to distinguish exactly where it was, though these fields here seem likely. The first use of the airfield was in July 1911 when 2 men from Stretton in Liverpool flew in to have lunch in Manchester with one Elliot Verdon Rowe, a pioneering British pilot and airplane designer who had just set up his own company designing and building aircraft, soon to be known as Avro. By the way, this is what planes looked like in 1908, one of Rowe's first designs. Just a few years later, when the First World War broke out, his Avro 504 looked like this and was employed in the thousands. The aerodrome closed in 1918 and the industrial park quickly swallowed up the land, hall, deer park and all. As depressing as this looks today, interestingly during World War II, aircraft and their parts were built in the industrial estate. In 1918, Manchester's aircraft focus shifted to a new aerodrome at Hough End, an open agricultural land bordering Wythenshawe and Chorlton-cum-Hardy, and not far from the now vanished Alexandra Park railway station. The site had been requisitioned by the War Department for the development and delivery of the airplanes for the RAF, as aviation shifted almost completely to a military focus. Unassembled plane parts were brought into the site by rail, either by Avro planes manufactured in Newton Heath, or those from the National Aircraft Factory No. 2 in Heaton Chapel. It was from here that Avro operated the country's first regular passenger service flight, taking fare payers to Blackpool via Southport Sands. A one-way 45-minute journey costing 5 guineas, or about £160 in today's money. Despite planes leaving here for Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam for a short period, the terms of the land lease meant that the airfield closed after just 5 years. Today the site is still largely open playing fields, football and rugby pitches. Princess Parkway cut through the site, and on the other side of the road council houses were later built. Over here, however, where the aerodrome's major buildings were located, including hangars, the site was handed over to the police, who still occupy the site today for the training and homing of their dogs and horses. As the saying goes, when one aerodrome closes, another one opens somewhere else, and in 1924 the next site picked was Woodford. At this point we've already migrated quite a distance away from Manchester city centre, but there are several reasons for this. not just to avoid the creep of residential spread or a new airfield potentially standing in the way of a new road, but because the technology was now seen as a primarily military venture. Worrying about passengers travelling into and out of the area was less of a concern for manufacturers like Avro, who bought the site for assembly and test flying. It was a better site and the first to, eventually, have concrete runways. During the Second World War, the Avro Lancaster and Anson aircraft were manufactured here, the former developed and constructed over at Avro's new headquarters in Chadderton, all playing a central role in the Western Allies' air combat operations. Avro was absorbed into the conglomerate of aircraft manufacturing companies known as Hawker Siddeley, and after the war became a hollow name that ceased to exist by the 1960s. Woodford continued to be used though, and in 1977 was bought by British Aerospace, which was a brief attempt to nationalise the conglomerate. Privatised and soon to become a huge international arms company wreaking chaos on the world, the latterly known BAE Systems retained Woodford until 2011, when the Nimrod project scheduled there was cancelled. With no more orders coming in, Woodford closed for good. The site was bought by the heir to the JCB fortune, yet another huge company with controversial doings. Today it's mostly being converted to a new housing estate, although it is home to the Avro Heritage Museum and, amazingly, part of the runway still exists, albeit probably not for very much longer. With the land at Alexandra Park no longer leasable and Avro moving to Woodford, by 1926 Manchester Council realised they needed a civil airfield. A site over at Barton was chosen as their ideal location, close to both the city centre and Trafford Park industrial estate. Barton was located at Chat Moss, where the boggy ground needed preparing. Having set their sights on becoming the first municipality in Britain to have a civic aerodrome, Manchester Council felt rushed to open one before anywhere else pipped them to the title, and so a temporary site was needed while Barton was under construction. At the time they had just acquired a lot of land in Wythenshawe to build Europe's largest estate of publicly owned housing, otherwise known as a council estate. Now this land here just north of Wythenshawe Park contained 4 fields which were converted to an incredibly small airfield with the barest of provisions installed. Only the letters MC painted in a white circle in the centre of the area allowed pilots to gauge their placement. What was then a country lane called Rackhouse Road ran along the eastern edge of the fields. When Wythenshawe was granted a licence to become an aerodrome in April 1929, Manchester became the first municipality in the country to have its own airport. It may have had the barest of facilities and no lighting installed, but Wythenshawe saw its fair share of use. Sadly, in January 1930, Barton opened properly and Wythenshawe was consigned to a rapid decline. Eventually, it became the Rackhouse estate and no trace of it is left at all. City Airport at Barton is still used today for lighter aircraft and helicopters, but it may have disappeared completely if the great age of helicopter commuting had taken off in the mid-20th century, as many had expected it to do. Indeed, famously, plans were drawn up to have helipads within the city centre itself, rendering Barton only useful for light aircraft. But that's a whole different story and probably a whole different video. Built in 1928, it was actually the UK's first purpose-built municipal airport, and as you can see today it has 4 runways which are all grass. At first Barton was managed by Northern Airlines, who used it for training, club and charter flights, using many of their Avro 504s, still an awesome looking aircraft. In 1933 the control tower was completed, the first outside of London, and it's still used today and believed to be the oldest of its type in Europe. Chartered flights operated between different parts of the UK here, off and on, but in 1938 all schedules were transferred to the newly built Ringway down here. It was Barton's location that prevented it from evolving into a larger airport. The soft ground prevented heavier aircraft from landing easily, and the large amount of standing water nearby created a lot of fog. It's also just down the road from the Liverpool to Manchester Railway, which when built in 1829 found trying to firm up the boggy Chat Moss its hardest obstacle. It's still used fairly frequently today, and because it's hardly changed, it's actually a great example of what an early aerodrome looked like. It's not uncommon to see low-flying fixed-wing aircraft taking off or landing whenever you're passing through the area. You'd have to be lucky though to catch a helicopter, which never really took off as a method of transport, all puns intended, as some thought they might. There are two other worthy mentions nearby, all part of the rush to expand air facilities during the Second World War. First, all the way over here near Warrington in fact, was Royal Navy Air Station Stretton. But it was initially built for the Air Force, as a base to protect both Liverpool and Manchester from nighttime Luftwaffe attacks. However, when the Luftwaffe switched tactics, the base was handed over to the Navy and the fleet's air arm. Usually referred to as HMS Blackcap, RNAS Stretton saw 41 squadrons based there during the war, as well as being a strategic maintenance yard. After the war, it continued to operate for a while before closing finally in 1958. Today, a large part of Stretton still remains in sight. In fact, if you've ever driven down this part of the M56, you'll have driven right through part of its footprint. USAF Burtonwood is another worthy mention, despite the relationship with Manchester now being stretched pretty much to breaking point. Without going into too much detail though, the aerodrome here was set up by the RAF in 1940 and handed over to the US Air Force in 1942 as a primary base for their own operations. Very quickly it became the largest airfield in Europe during those war years, and by the end of the war some 18,000 American servicemen were stationed there. After the war, with Europe now deep in the middle of the Cold War, the US maintained its presence at Burtonwood so as to keep as many footholds in the continent as it could. Most famously, some of its regular visitors were B-29 superfortresses, high-altitude strategic bombers, one of which crashed on Bleaklow in 1948 while descending too soon in heavy fog. US presence at the site waned off and on over the years until the Cold War ended and the site was closed in 1994. Today it's another former site bisected by a motorway, and today virtually nothing is left to suggest it was there at all. The last remaining hangars were demolished in 2008 and only the northern perimeter of its outline is still traceable in the footprint. The rest lost below another industrial estate. And this all brings us back to Ringway, which, of course, is a story for another video.